Okay, I want to begin. Lake, thank you very much for introducing me to this group. As you say, these are, the collateral benefits, if you like, within what is otherwise a rather gloomy period for all of us. So, yeah, and it's a pleasure to, engage in this conversation with all of you. I'm always looking out for like-minded people. And when I go to these things, I always carry the hope in me that something more will come out of these meetings in terms of, proceeding and doing something more. So that's that. I don't want to do a formal presentation or make a speech or a lecture or anything. Instead, what I thought is I would introduce the topic and introduce the subject, around which I would like to have a conversation with all of you. But it's basically an introduction to facilitate a conversation rather than a formally structured, lecture. I don't have any written notes. I'm just going to speak off my head. And please feel free to stop me, interrupt, ask questions. And as I said, this is a conversation. It's a two-way process. So I think the idea for this talk today, or this subject rather, this theme, came about when Lake and I were having a conversation and we were discussing about the farmers' laws. And I said, look, we are talking about farmers' law in a very insular Indian context, but there is a larger global context to this. And we need to really, understand that global context. And that's when Lake said, why don't you come and do a presentation for us in our weekly meeting? And so here I am. So what I thought I would do is to speak, address two questions. And one is, what is the source of these laws? And the second question is, how did the law, that the three laws that has become such a focal point of the protests in India, how did it travel from the source of the laws to where it has now landed? So I want to trace that trajectory and, see how it has traveled. And I think this is important because of two reasons. One is sometimes we talk about these laws in an insular Indian context and forget that there is an international context to it. And when we are not specific about that international context, then, all the talk about imperialism becomes blah, 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 because it becomes an abstract thing. So how concretely is this really imperialist, if you want to call it that? And how do we make those connections in very concrete ways? That is one thing. Or otherwise, what we do is we talk about, the imperialism, globalization, WTO, World Bank, etc. But we can't make that connection in very concrete ways to the specific laws that are now being enacted in India, whether it's the farm laws or labor laws or whatever. And the reason that this is important is, I think, and this comes to the next thing, is that the modalities or the modus operandi, if you like, of imperialism and colonialism has changed significantly since 1945, and law has become central to that. So, law and legal. So I'm going to focus on law today, not because I'm a legal scholar or I'm a barrister, that's not the reason, but I do think it's important to understand how law operates in connecting those dots that take us from global imperialism to a very local farmers' protest that is happening in India. So that's the kind of where I want to go with this. So starting with the first point on the source of these laws. One of the things that people often don't realize or understand is that's at least since 1945. And why 1945? Because that's when the World War II ends and we have this so-called new world order. And all these international organizations, World Bank, IMF, are all established at that point in time. So since then, the source of law in countries around the world, in particular the newly independent so-called countries that were emerging from colonialism, etc., the source of law has increasingly become international organizations. How do international organizations become a source of law for national governments? And it is because they set up the frameworks within which states must operate. Yeah. So I won't go into too much details about these. So for example, structural adjustment programs. What do structural adjustment programs do? They tell states what you can spend the money on, what you can't spend the money on, and where you should invest, where you cannot invest, etc. And that forces the states then to enact legislation in their own countries to comply with those international commitments. Similarly, if you look at World Bank so-called good governance programs. Now, the good government programs restructure the architecture of the state. So, for example, in the good governance programs, governments and World Bank has implemented them around 160 countries and spent some 300 billion pounds, US dollars, sorry, and in funding to get states to change and reform the state structure. So what do good governance programs target? They want states to change public sector. They want states to change taxation. They want states to change their judicial structure. They want states to implement what is called rule of law programs. So these are all very core legal lawmaking powers. Once states sign up to these things, they are bound to then implement those laws, introduce legislation in the countries to implement these things. So that is why I say international organizations have become the source of laws. So that brings us to this question of specifics of this particular agrarian sector law. In 1995, India signed up to the WTO, as you know. And at that time also, there were extensive protests in India. We were all part of it at that time. And except Maharashtra, where Shetkari Sangatna was the only supporter of World Bank and of the WTO agreement. And I'll just do a brief comment on that. It's not central to my point today. Shetkari Sangatna's leader, Sharad Joshi, was himself an ex-World Bank employee who came to Maharashtra, formed the state Shetkari Sangatna, in order to bring about agrarian reforms in India. But that's the personal side. That's not a legal story. That's the political story, yeah, if you like. So as a consequence of the, and in 1995, when there was discussion around what is called the Dunkel draft. Dunkel was the chairperson of WTO, the GATT negotiations, and he proposed this draft. And at that time, Karnataka farmers stormed Kargil factory in Karnataka, because of the impact on agriculture and so on. And of course, this present Rakesh Tikayat's father was involved in those agitations. Anyway, there was widespread opposition and against what the WTO's proposal of agreement on agriculture, the agreement on agriculture. And the agreement on agriculture proposes three things. The key: opening markets, agricultural markets, doing away with domestic support price, and mark my words, all these things are now going to be linked to what is happening today, and doing away with export subsidies. So those were the three main things about that, to which all third world countries adamantly, totally opposed all of that, those agreement on agriculture. Okay. Now, why is this so? Why was this so important? And it was a very, very controversial thing. It took about 8-9 years to negotiate the agreement on agriculture, because there was opposition both in the Western countries and in the third world countries. In the West, there were different reasons for opposition. In the third world, there were different reasons for opposition. In the West, what had happened since 1950, the Western governments had been subsidizing their own agricultural sector, their own farmers, some of whom were small farmers, but many of them were large corporations. As a result of which there was overproduction in the West, and therefore, cheap food exports became a very important part of the whole, and Western governments were subsidizing their farmers for exporting products to third world countries. Some of you may remember we got PL 480 funds, and we got, rotten wheat at that time, so there was all of that. So there was that kind of pressure. But from the third world perspective, they said, we cannot compete with your prices, we will collapse, because most of third world farmers are subsistence farmers. We don't have, Cargill and Monsanto and all that kind of farming in our part. People will. So this was the main opposition to it. But the government did sign up. And because of the opposition, the WTO agreed to defer the implementation of it for third world countries. So that we got a deferral for about 9 years was the period for which it was extended. The extension was given. And then at the end of 9 years, obviously, the US, which is home to the largest agro-business corporations, started pushing countries, especially India, to agree to start implementing it. Okay, we gave you an extension. The extension period is over. Now get on with the job, basically. And in 2005, there were, I don't want to go into too much details about this because these are complex agreements. I just want to give an outline of that. To cut a long story short, in 2013, we came to what is called the Bali package, which was the WTO's Bali ministerial meeting. And the US had been pushing India, in particular, to open up its market to Western corporations. And since 2006, Walmart has been eyeing Indian agricultural sector in a very big way. Yeah, and they have made several agreements with Bharti Retail, and that was didn't work out. And they've been trying other routes, but let's not get into those things. But the main issue for the US was, and this was the argument about implementing the agreement on agriculture by the Indian government. The Indian government said, we do need to buy food for our own, public distribution system, and therefore we should be exempted from a complete open market. So India climbed down from a position where it said we cannot have free access at all in 1995 to the position that we need to have substantial, subsidy for agriculture, because they said it's a question of our people, depend on public distribution, rationing system, etc., and we cannot do. And the US argument was, you cannot claim public subsidy for 75% of the population, because 75% of the population depend on cheap rations, public distribution system for food. And it's, if you come to think of it, it's a bizarre situation. I mean, 75% of the people do depend on subsidized food, and they will, they can't live without that. But at the same time, the US argument that this is majority of your population, so how can you claim subsidy and exemptions on this thing? Anyway, but the interesting thing is, after the Bali, Obama visited India in 2014, I think, after the Bali agreement, and started pushing pressure putting pressure on the government to implement that. And the Modi government, 2014, took an unreserved position, if you like, on implementation of the Bali package, and started arguing that Bali package must be expedited, implementation must be expedited. Congress dithered on that a bit before that, because doing away with rationing system in India, if India is a pretty big ask for any government, because it's basically leads to mass starvation. Yeah. Especially urban population who completely depend on rations. So that was as far as that goes. And then the Bali package was again on the agenda of the US-India trade negotiations in 2018, etc. So the government was pushed, because of the commitment that it had made to implement the agreement on agriculture. It was now in a position where it had to implement it fully and completely. So this is one part of that legal story, if you like. And that is what, if you look at the three laws that we have today, what is it that they are doing? They're doing away with the Public Distribution Act, procurement for public distribution, by amending, Essential Services Act, which is amending without amendment. It's a repeal without formally repealing, because it takes away the core of the Essential Services Act. And it also does an open market access, again, a key WTO principle. And of course, contract farming, which is a stepping stone for corporate agriculture. And I will come to all of these things in a bit. So this is as far as the international law framework is concerned. Now I want to go to the next step about the interim. I said the route. I want to trace the trajectory from which international law, how does international law, whatever that may be, become or migrate and become national law? Yeah, and that is what I want to get into. Now, the important thing to remember is international law is not something, it's not a homogeneous thing. It comes in bits and pieces. It comes in one aspect now, another aspect tomorrow, a third aspect another day. If you go back and look at the different types of legislation that has been introduced in India, that now forms the basis for the three, the conditions, if you like, the infrastructure, if you like, for these three laws, there has been a systematic step. And I will just flag up some of the key moments in the shift. The first was, of course, the Land Acquisition Act. Yeah, the Land Acquisition Act was amended, and each debate operates in a very insular manner. And that is why I'm very concerned that we are not able to join up these dots. Now, what does the Land Acquisition Act say? The Land Acquisition Act opened up, created what is called a national land market. Whereas land market in India was always, I mean, it was there, and it was not there. It was not formally recognized because large tracts of land in India are owned by small farmers, where land laws are very different. And then, of course, the public sector is a big owner of land, for example, railways, etc., etc. So this notion of a land market and, free buying and selling of land is not really, has never gelled in India so far. So the Land Acquisition Act actually tries to nail that down. And that was again opposed across a wide cross-section of people. And many NGOs thought, oh, maybe this is good because the government introduced a twin legislation for compensation. So they thought that, okay, if the Land Acquisition Act takes land, at least we can get compensation, etc. Again, I don't want to go into the details of that one. This is just a rough sketch, if you like. But what does the Land Acquisition Act do? How is it related to these laws? The Land Acquisition Act, first of all, opens the land market to global investors. So straight away, we had Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, investors trying to put big money into there, and Adivasis protesting, and all of those things. Some of you may be familiar with that. And Central India became a big thing because the mining corporations wanted to come in. But now, with the farm laws, if the farmers are not able to make their farming viable, there needs to be a legislative framework for buying up that land. So Land Acquisition Act, in a way, creates the foundation to do that by allowing private actors to acquire land. So an estate agent, a retailer, or anybody for that matter can go and buy land, which they could not do earlier. There were a lot of restrictions around purchase of land from people. So the Land Acquisition Act actually allows private players, without which failing farms and farming activities today in these bills that farmers are worried about, they could not have sold that land. So the infrastructure for that was already created. The second important legislation leading up to this, that creates the basis, is the Land Titling Act, which came up in 2013. See how bit by bit the agreement on agriculture is being introduced into India, right? What is the land titling? Now, if I don't know how many of you are familiar with Indian agricultural scenario or land ownership or any of those things. But land titling in India has always been a historical problem, because in the United Kingdom, for example, land titles have existed from Richard I first in 1100 and whatever. In India, we never had those systems. Yeah, and land ownership was very local. There was no ownership. Very often, village communities controlled the land, so on and so forth. When the East India Company came, they messed it up further because they introduced the Zamindari Act, which turned the local, aristocrats into rent collectors. So the zamindar actually had no zameen. He was more a revenue collector for the East India Company. That did not work. Then they introduced Rayatwari system in the Deccan Plateau in the southern parts. And the Rayatwari system, the East India Company said, we are the public because the village owns the land. And that means it is similar to crown lands. And therefore, we own it, because we are now the new crown, so to speak, which is a radically different concept from village ownership. Village owning something and the queen owning something, or the king at that time, is quite a completely different radical thing. But that was the logic. So the the farmers, the peasants became tenants of the state. So there was no land titling. And then came the independence movement, where there were mass land confiscations. This has happened in Punjab in a big way. It has happened in South India in a big way. So, if you oppose the British government, your land got confiscated. If you, fought against this thing, your land got confiscated. So to cut a long story short, there was no stable title, land title. Okay. Now, after independence, the government introduced, what do you do with this? The whole continent doesn't have land titles. So what do you do? The government introduced land reform bills and said land to the tiller. So whoever is tilling the land will be theirs. But this legislation was never implemented anywhere in India except in Kashmir. Implemented thoroughly, I mean. So again, there was no land title. And most land transactions, if you have dealt with this, in Maharashtra, it's a very state-wise land. We have what is called the 712 extract. There is an entry there, which is proof of possession, not proof of ownership. Okay. If this is the scenario, how does an international company, corporation like Monsanto or Cargill or whatever, who do they contract with? Because to have, agribusiness, you need two contracting parties. If the other side contracting party does not have clear title, then the problem becomes, who do you contract with? You can have extended family. One brother will say, I sold it. Another brother will come and say, I have all these kind of issues that are very, very common to anybody who knows Indian scenario. So they want clear title to be given to these people. Now, I think it was in 2000 sometime, there was a global campaign in which many farmers organizations from developing countries were also part of, like Via Campesina, for example, and some of you may have heard of these organizations. And they've established what is called the Land Coalition. And the Land Coalition has NGOs, has people from third world countries, governments, WHO, Food and Agricultural Organization, World Bank, just about every organization in the world is part of that coalition. And their central focus was to introduce land titles. And these land titles were defended as human rights of farmers. Farmers have a right to their land, and therefore they should have a proper title. Yeah. That discourse, of course, completely conceals the fact that title makes you a party with capacity to contract. Yeah. So the Land Titling Act in 2013, which is again a mess. I mean, let's not get into that. Most laws in India become a mess after a while. But the Land Titling Act then aimed at giving titles to land, which in Maharashtra, at least, I don't know about other parts, that's the state I come from, it became a huge scam, because I know that in places like Roha, which is about 1 hour's drive from Mumbai, Reliance offered its building to set up a disputes tribunal. So what would happen to Roha farmers? The Reliance, Reliance man will go and threaten and go to the Tehsildar's office, take off their name, because only the extract is only proof of possession. So they will say, I'm now in possession of this land. They will give him 100, 200 rupees, whatever, 1,000 rupees. Rates have gone up now. So they will give them a thing and get their names changed. The poor farmer doesn't know anything about this. That fellow will come and say, oh, you're trespassing on my land. I'm the one with my name on the land records. Then the farmer has to go to the disputes tribunal, which is in Reliance building. And a retired Reliance man is the new judge there. So, this is what was happening. This is what happened in land title. I have to say, this is Maharashtra focused, and I don't know how the Land Titling Act was implemented in other states, as it is a very local legislation. So this is something that, but without the Land Titling Act, you cannot have contract farming. So you see, that is the link to the third one, the part of these three laws, one of which was contract farming. And contract farming is necessary if all farming has to become commercial farming, because you have to produce for somebody to be able to sell that. So that is as far as this is concerned. The fourth thing that changed that has come, which is retailing in food. Now, most of you know that in India, most of us buy our food from local bania and local, shops, small shopkeepers, who are a big part, even now. I mean, 93% of Indian food retailing is with small shopkeepers. But from 2013-14 onwards, there is a big push for the supermarkets to come into Indian retailing. They were 2%, I think, in 2014 or something. They have inched their way to becoming 6%. But there is a huge, drive to capture what people's global agribusiness see as this huge Indian market. This is why Walmart went into agreement with Bharti Telecom, and Bharti Retail, and then that failed, and then they are trying other things. As I said, that is not something that I want to get into today, unless it comes up in the discussion. So this combination of factors creates the environment for these three laws today. That is where I want to come. Now you will say, how come India is an independent nation? It's a sovereign nation. It has its own constitution. It has its own laws. Why does it feel bound to implement these laws? And why has this become such a big, what does the World Bank do? I mean, does it beat up Modi, or does it, how does this happen? So I want to just come back to some of the questions about the Indian Constitution itself. Yeah, most of us, and I want to particularly emphasize this because these days there is a lot of talk about defending the Constitution, which is, of course, it's a debate to be had another time. The Constitution, I want to make the point, has two aspects. Any constitution, not just ours, any constitution, there are two aspects to it. The first is that a constitution articulates the aspirations of a nation. So typically, whether it's the American Constitution, we the people, we believe in democracy, all men are equal, all those things. In India, of course, we the people, we will, the state shall promote justice, social, economic, political. Those are aspirational statements. And these aspirational statements are extremely important because it gives us some sense of what our national collective values are. But that is not the only job of a constitution. So when the Constitution says the state will do away with, poverty, it will do away with caste, it will give women equal opportunities, these are aspirations. It's an articulation that's what we want to be as a nation. The Constitution also has another role, which is absolutely critical to understand, about which we don't talk about much. And that is, it's a settlement of the state. It settles the institution of the state and how states should exercise power. And this is a crucial and critical aspect of a constitution. So what is the division of powers, the role of the judiciary, separation of powers, within the administration, what are the bounds, relationship between states, financial relationship between center and state. These are all established by a constitution. When we look at the settlement of the state, as we call it, in thing, you will find that there is a continuity in the Indian constitutional developments from 1900s, 1905 to now. So the present constitution, in terms of the distribution of powers and exercise of powers, it is more or less, same as the 1935 reforms that the British government introduced. Yeah. So in terms of the architecture of the state, those powers are very much intact to the way the British left us with. There is hardly any change. Yeah. Let us take a crucial question about devolution. We never became a federation, even though that was a central question. It has come up again and again. And I will connect this to our farm laws now. For example, in 1972, if you remember the Anandpur Sahib resolution, the demand was for complete federalism. Indira Gandhi took it another way, promoted Bhindranwala, then finished him off. That's again another story. But it started with 1972 Anandpur Sahib resolution demanding greater federal structure. Before that, 1950, we got our new constitution. 1953, we were already struggling for linguistic reorganization of states. Yeah, that was the next thing after 47. So this question of greater power, and then of course, after emergency, all the regional parties came in, and we have never had a stable central government without coalitions from 1977 to 2014, when and 2019, when the second Modi government boasted that they have for the first time brought back a central administration in India. Why is that important? Because agriculture was always a state subject. Yeah. What these laws are doing now, and I'll come to in a bit, how the constitution allows this state subject to suddenly gives the central government authority to enact those laws. So this is as far as that thing is concerned. When so what is the British Constitution that we are now following? That thing. In India, we never had federalism. We had what is called devolution. Devolution is a very old, at least people in UK will be familiar, especially with everything going on in Northern Ireland and Scotland, etc. What is the difference between devolution and federation? Federation, the states are almost a mini government. They concede certain limited powers to a central government. In devolution, the central government allows you to exercise some of its powers, which can be taken away anytime. It was taken away in Northern Ireland, as you know. It has been taken away in India so many times with governor's rule being imposed, etc., etc. So, but that power to do that is there in the Constitution itself. It is there in the Constitution because it was introduced in 1919 during Simon Commission again, etc., as a way of appeasing Indians. Okay, we are devolving your powers to you, and so we will leave you with this. But the Governor General always had the power to take it back. Now the Governor and the President of India has that power to take it back. But that structure has always remained. The other thing about this thing is that in the Indian Constitution, now, coming back to this question of how come, because the WTO says something or because the World Bank says something, we have to, the state government and the union government is able to implement it. Because no treaties, international treaties, do not need parliamentary approval. So once you go to, Brussels or New York or Washington or wherever and sign a treaty, the union government automatically gets the authority to enact laws on that subject. This has happened with Indira Gandhi in relation to environmental laws, whereas environment is a state subject. It has happened in relation to water laws, whereas water is a state subject. Now it is happening to agriculture, even though agriculture is a state subject, because the government has to implement an international treaty. Yeah, and because the government has to it can try to directly get this. Now, there is always a politics, devolution. Of course, British government has devolved power to Scotland, but just think about whether it can take it back. In legal theory, it can take it back, but imagine the politics of it, right? So it's one thing to have legal powers. It's quite another thing to have the political power to take it back. Now, in India, Congress dithered on this because touching agriculture is an extremely destabilizing factor, as we are seeing now, because vast majority, 70%, 75% of the people's livelihoods depend on agriculture. So what the Congress government and our previous governments did was they introduced a commission, and something I should have mentioned, something important, is after the effect of opening up under WTO, opening up in bits and pieces sectors of agricultural markets for external operators and implementing neoliberal reforms, was mass suicide of farmers. So, we have 28 suicides every day, even now. That is the scale of farmers' suicides. And that was directly started after the extension period on agriculture, agreement on agriculture ended. And, input costs started going up, etc. So, I missed that bit. But coming back to what I was saying, because Congress dithered on this and didn't have the guts, they first appointed, they said, farmers suicide, we'll appoint a commission. Swaminathan Commission was appointed, then, bits. Then they introduced model bills. And those model bills are quite similar to present laws. But the model bills, because it was a union subject, and the states just said, all right, model bill, whatever, we'll see, we'll follow. No, states didn't bother about it. Because what state is going to confront their farmers with that kind of thing? It was there. But in 2009, when Niti Aayog was established, when this government came to power, Niti Aayog's first and objective was to do away with federal structure, whatever was there, devolution, federal structure, and to have more centralized thing. So one of the things that these laws promote is the one nation, one market principle. And the one nation, one market principle then aligns, the central government's authority to deliver on these international treaties. Because if you're going to have 29 markets around the country and each state doing its own thing, how does the government then keep up its international obligations that it has already signed up to?
Dr. Radha, can we start the discussion now, if you don't mind?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just got carried away. Yeah.
Yeah. Many of these things we'll come back to that. If you want to wind up, then we can start the discussion.
No, that's fine. As I said, it was just, I was just trying to, connect as many dots as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, many of these things will come up in the discussion.
But I think you have the overview and where I was going with this.
Yeah, it was a very good summary, and this gave you a completely different picture than what I had in my mind. Gave a completely new dimension. It made me thinking now.
Thomas, can I comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask the question, how come the Western world, Americans and the Europeans, are able to inject so much subsidies into their farming community and yet almost deny the subsidies to the third world countries. And I fail to see the rationale how in an open sort of debate that they can actually get away with that. But that was my main question. But what you have just raised later on is this which to me is quite troubling, is the difference between devolution and federalism. You know, I was led to believe that what the Indian government, the laws that they are introducing are centralized, and that they don't have the constitutional right to do that. But your definition of devolution and federalism seems to have thrown that into question, and nobody seems to be talking about that in the general discourse of these arguments. So the two questions I had there.
Okay, Thomas, do you want me to answer that? Or,
Yeah, you can answer, yeah.
Okay. No, on your first question about how Western countries, continue to subsidize their farmers so heavily, this has been an ongoing battle between the third world countries and the developed countries throughout this process, since even before WTO. This has been the big battle between them. And it's not a new question. And it comes up again and again, and it comes up in all, and that is why the Seattle WTO meeting failed. That is why the Doha round never took off, and agriculture was very central to this, because understandably, agriculture is, the main source of livelihood for most third world country people, not just India. So that is something. On your second question about devolution and federation, the point here is, okay, the difference between the two, in devolution, the union government can take back the powers. They can give it to you and say, you exercise our powers. For example, now, the government says, okay, you exercise the powers of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland, for example. But tomorrow, if the troubles resume, they can take it. Yeah. Whereas in federal structure, and this is the problem with the United States, for example, each state is an independent country that agrees to form a union, a federation. Now, in India, what happens? The constitution does not clarify the federal structure. This has been a long-term thing. And in the union list, there are three lists: the state subjects, concurrent subject, and union subject. Union subject, only the union government can make law. Concurrent subject, both states and union governments can make law. And state subject, only states can make law. So agriculture is a state subject and only states can make law. However, the union list says international treaties, the obligation to implement international treaties is with the union government. So what happens if you sign an international treaty that says we will give open access to agriculture, we will open up, investments in the agrarian sector to internationally to meet our WTO requirements, agreements. So the constitution says, because you have signed an international treaty, then the union government automatically gets the power to implement those international treaties. Are you following what I'm saying? Yeah.
I follow that, but then I think the farmers were arguing that these international treaties are related to food produce, not to food grain, and they seem to be drawing I don't know whether it's splitting the hairs, but I mean you seem to be saying no, the farmers don't really have an argument on that.
No, that was the issue in the Bali package. So, you know, the Bali package was about how much food you could procure as a state, supposedly for food security. Now, I didn't mention the Food Security Bill, which is another Food Security Act, which came in 2013, again, as part before the Bali negotiations, etc.
Paul wanted to ask something. Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that very interesting, insightful account. My question is about continuity. There have been farmers and peasants revolts, peaceful movements, resistance since the 18th century. And then through the British Raj, there's a long history of farmers' resistance around rents and taxes. To what extent? So in one sense, they were anti-colonial movements, as well as against the landlords and so on. To what extent do you regard the current movement as being revolutionary in the sense of being anti-neo-colonial? In what sense can you regard this movement as a kind of a vanguard movement, as an exemplar for the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, clearly it comes from that whole tradition. If you look at the Gadar movement, it started with the agricultural reforms. If you go before that, I mean, if you go into the, you know, rebellions against the East India Company, the agrarian sector touching that has always led to opposition. 1857, it was the peasants and soldiers. Yeah. So this agitation, in my view, is very much within that tradition. And it touches the rawest nerve, if you like, in the globalization agenda. Because by directly touching the question of farm laws and this whole global architecture, it is inherently anti-imperialist, if you want to call it, if you want to use that kind of language. Yeah, it is, and therefore, without saying it, it has a strong anti-globalization, anti-imperialist, you know, content to it, even though, you know, the articulation of that. And that is why I think when they say that this is not only about the farmers, this is about the nation, it is true. It is not only about the farmers. And that is why I tried to, you know, establish the whole framework, the legal framework, and how the infrastructure was created bit by bit, retail sector, titling, you know, land acquisition, this, that, to enable this. And those dots are essential, because if these three laws are taken back, it's one of the biggest setbacks for globalization and WTO that you can ever imagine.
Thank you. And just a link point there, it's to do with the demographics of the farmers as a whole movement. As I understand it, sitting in Birmingham, what I see is a unity of purpose between different faiths, between genders, between caste and class. To what extent is it kind of a unifying movement?
Genders.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to caste and class, and apart from gender is a different issue. But as far as caste and class are concerned, I think that the rural dynamic of it is quite different from the urban dynamic. In the urban areas, it becomes a symbolic identity politics, you know, and access to resources and some of those kind of things. In the rural areas, it is very much based on the operational aspects of agrarian relations. Yeah, so Dalits doing manual labor or certain agricultural work, women doing certain kinds of agricultural work, and, you know, the patriarch controlling the agriculture, could be Hindu or Muslim or Christian or anybody, but they're still patriarchal. in their outlook on these things. Women still have their fixed roles in agricultural production. The Dalits still have their fixed roles in agricultural production. So in that sense, it's a different dynamic. But that dynamic, the unification of people in the agrarian sector, is now being done by the WTO. And because if those laws continue, everybody is going to lose. The Dalits are going to lose, the women are going to lose, the men are going to lose. So those old divisions, they have not been consciously, I would say, people have not set out to, oh, we have to do this. But the situation is forcing them where either they all live together or they all die, finish. So that is what is pushing the unity. There is an objective reality that is pushing that unity.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Kalpana wants to.
You have to unmute yourself, Kalpana.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it's taken me a bit of time to see. Thank you very much for very clear sort of elucidation, because when I read this different article, it gets quite complicated. I haven't got a legal background or whatever, and it is very confusing about the various different acts and how they enact and how its impact on various aspects. I wanted to just sort of ask further what Lake was saying. If it was quite obvious that this external organization like World Bank and WTO are forcing, say India, say we're talking about India in a particular direction, because earlier on, post-independence, India was in Soviet Union camp, and there's obviously been a slow change into this pro-American, if you like, globalization camp. Why was that accepted by the Indian government in the first place? Because it was, it was quite obvious that they were being forced into that. Why did the central government accept those sort of things? I mean, there are obviously other countries like Venezuela and other examples, I realize that, but they were much smaller countries, whereas India had a bigger population, reasonably big economy. Why did they accept those sort of things in the first place, treaties in the first place? And then specifically, it would be really interesting, because I come from Maharashtra, for you to develop why is Maharashtra and the Maharashtrian organization slightly different? Because is it much more commercial already? And I think there is a sort of background of cooperative movements and things in Karnataka and Maharashtra and things. Does that have impact on the agricultural economy there or not?
Okay. Two very questions. On your first question, why is the Indian government accepting the WTO conditions? How is the WTO able to force the Indian government, etc.? I don't think that it's a question of forcing the Indian government. There are forces within Indian society that are willing to play ball with this. That is why Bharti Retail went into retailing, food retailing, and they saw it. So if you look at globalization, it has opened up a whole gamut of opportunities for the so-called shining Indian.
Yeah.
And if you look at, for example, Adani, in 1988, 89, he was a simple commodity trader in Gujarat. Since then, his star has risen alongside the political stars of people like Modi and the globalization star. So these are three, parallel trajectories. So if there were no Adani, Ambani and Bharti Retails and Aditya Birla and all that lot in India, we would not, who's going to set up these, things? Now you can imagine the proximity of these Indian, dalal, capitalists, whatever you want to call them, comprador, whatever you want to call them, with people like Walmart. Now, Walmart says we are, India is a great opportunity for markets, etc. But we don't want to come directly into India, and we don't want the name Walmart attached to any of those businesses. So, that is the level of their thing. So India, compared to, say, other countries, a country like Mali or Burkina Faso, where also these same laws have been implemented, but there is no local class that can pick up the ball and play the game. India has it. So that is why, Modi is funded by Adani, and Adani is able to build all the grain silos for food stocking and all of that. So it's kind of, I don't want to make it a very reductive thing. There is a dynamic to that. But, if that shining India was not there, they would not have done this. The second aspect of that is, and this is where I think the colonial history becomes very important. You mentioned Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is oil rich. So Venezuela is, subject to the politics of oil, if you like. Whereas India has historically been throughout, its imperial history, colonial history, it has been a major source of cheap labor and a major source of agrarian products. This, if you look at the whole history. That history continues in more modernized forms. We are still the largest supplier of labor. That's why I'm here, which is in my sector, this is cheap labor, but there you go. I don't want to push the point too much, but you see what I'm saying, that we are still a source of cheap labor. Earlier, the slaves were cheap labor, then came the indentured labor. Now the corporations go there and set up special economic zones and sweatshops and get cheap products, but it's still cheap labor. And of course, armed forces, which I won't go into because that's another, kettle of fish, but it's a different issue. So that is there. Now to your next question on Maharashtra. It's an interesting one. And I think it has to do with the history of Maharashtra. If you know the whole rise of Sakar Samrats, as we call them. Yeah? The Sakar Samrat came out of cooperative movement.
Yes, yeah.
And the ecology of Maharashtra, you can own 50 acres of land and be a poor farmer. You can own 5 acres of land and be a rich farmer, depending on whether you have water or not have water.
Yeah.
This is 50 acres of land, you can be an agricultural laborer. So that has to do partly, I think, to the ecology of the Deccan Plateau, and in particular. It doesn't happen in Konkan Maharashtra so much.
No.
So Konkan Maharashtra is still the old village. Even now, if you go to the Vadas, every Vada is almost an autonomous kind of village economy, because they have a little bit of paddy, a small fish pond, and then they have a few coconut trees, and you can live independently, comfortably in that Vada without, going anywhere except maybe for clothes and jewelry and things like that. So that is there still in coastal Maharashtra, but in this thing. The other thing is that unlike Punjab, with Green Revolution had its dynamic and uptake, which I won't go into here. Here, because of the cooperative structures, they were much more corporatized and open to corporate things.
Yeah.
So, for example, USAID at one time, I'm sorry if this is going into too much detail about Maharashtra or any one region, but USAID, after Sharad Joshi came and retired from World Bank, came to Maharashtra, formed the Shetkari Sangatna, this whole business of agricultural agreement on agriculture started, and he was the main voice in India to speak. No other state took up this WTO agreement at all, except Maharashtra. But then, you see, and then USAID started funding in Jalgaon, the banana farmers of Jalgaon. Yeah. And they took all, I remember some of my friends' parents and things went for them. And they, toured them all over America and showed them all the banana plantations. And those farmers came back and they thought they were going to become the next, big banana growers and everything at that time. But obviously nothing like that has happened because, India is not America. So there are, I think, local factors, but I would say that the cooperative movement on which, and many of those cooperative movement leaders of the post-independence era, they were very left-wing.
Yes, that's what I can't understand. What's happened?
They were very left-wing. I remember going to, because I used to work with trade unions before I came, and we had a Sheikh Mazur union, and went to Satana for an agricultural conference and staying in a house. We entered this man's house. He's got Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin right on the floor, and the thing on the wall. But for him, and we had long conversations with, many of them, and for them, modernization allowed them to think about the organizational aspects of agriculture and make those 5 acres into a much more productive farm than the guy with 50 acres. So cooperatives are already corporatized.
Yes.
And in Maharashtra, if you know that it is sugar elections are much more important than any national Delhi elections or any other elections.
I wanted to ask one question. Is that so? This the American wheat and Australian wheat, because they are more productive, they should be cheaper than India. If that is the case, Adani can import those wheat and still have they can have the food market. Why do they want to buy from the farmers? Are they not allowed to import these food grains now?
It is the importation that has caused the suicides. No? See, those imports, it was the imports and cotton and import. See, if you look at the farmer's suicide, the first suicides come with cotton, Vidarbha. Yeah. Where that's all cotton farmers, Karnataka. The cotton belt is where the first farmer's suicide starts coming. Why? Because cotton prices collapse and they can't meet the cotton. So, there is that import. Paddy and wheat are still not that open, it's still the resistance, as you can see now. So it is that. So I think there is this, the reason why Walmart does not want to go directly into India and do that, and they have kept this in small sectors like cotton, like, there was a big fight on patents, which I have not touched at all, which is very closely linked to agriculture. And you're right, and they won't allow that because we have a class in India which will say, why should we allow you to come here when we don't get any cut out of it? It's that Dalali thing, no?
Yeah.
So in other countries, in Mexico, for example, they just went and dumped their corn and the Mexican farmers were finished, flat. They can't do that in India because there will be resistance from the people, but there will also be local people like the Adanis and Ambanis and Birlas and everybody who will say, where are we in this game? Because they're strong enough to do that. So they have to make an alliance with these people in order to enter the Indian markets. They can't enter it all on their own. And that was my point about Walmart not wanting their name to be used.
Yeah, Philippa wants to say something. Philippa?
Hi. I think you've thank you, by the way, for a wonderful, enlightening talk. I'm going to be asking it might be almost a naive question. Since 1995, when trade has been carried on between, I imagine, between India and other countries or other companies, I can't quite work out which is which, How's it actually being conducted? If that makes sense, if they haven't yet established the agricultural part of the WTO agreement, how has India actually been trading with individual countries? And is it the Indian state or the Indian country, or is it different states that have been making any type of agreements?
You mean in relation to food crops?
Well, anything. In relation to anything, yeah, in relation to food crops in particular. So you can trade on WTO terms, you can agree to different parts of the WTO, can you?
And there are 4 different WTO agreements. There is an agreement on services, which there is an agreement on intellectual property, there is an agreement on trade, and so on. And in trade, WTO negotiations are quite detailed. They go sector by sector and item by item, like, textiles. So they will have cotton textiles, mixed fabric textiles, ready-made garments, and so it's very, very detailed. So in different sectors, they negotiate different terms. And that is why the WTO negotiations are so political. For example, in the textile sector, where there's tremendous competition because every country has got, some form. The agreements were they introduced a quota system. Yeah. There were in other fields, for example, in cotton. Yeah, they said, oh, but we are going to give the farmers patented cotton seeds and BT cotton, and it turned out BT cotton was a disaster because of locust infestations. Then they started patenting regime. So it happens in different ways. So you have to look at it item by item.
And have there been agreements on wheat exports?
No, it will come after these bills.
Okay, so there is a chance that this could be fought successfully.
Hopefully, okay. That's why we are all talking about it, aren't we?
Paul.
Hi there. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Nick was there. Nick.
This is a relation. Do you want to go first, Lek? He's unmuted.
He's muted. Yeah, Paul.
Okay, so this is just to tease out your thoughts about the tensions in the BJP between Hindutva nationalism versus this comprador global capitalism. How is that managed, those tensions? Because they seem to be contradictory.
I don't see any tensions there, because Hindutva is the ideological face of globalization in India. It has come alongside and grown alongside, liberalization and globalization. It's the ideological facade. There is nothing, just because they call it Hindutva, there is nothing Hindu or there is nothing nationalist in it.
Ooh.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
You've answered my question, thank you.
Interesting.
And I mean, we can have another conversation on this if you like, but I mean, on unpacking that proposition.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question from Radha?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Velu, yeah.
தோழர் வணக்கம். தோழர் வணக்கம். தோழர் நான் தமிழ்ல தான் கேள்வி கேட்பேன். அவங்களுக்கு வேணா நீங்க இங்கிலீஷ்ல சொல்லுங்க, பிரச்சனை இல்ல. Very beautiful.
He will ask his question in Tamil and I will translate for him. Okay.
ரொம்ப அழகா இருந்தது. நீங்க உங்களுடைய அந்த ஸ்ட்ரக்சர் வெரி பியூட்டிஃபுல்லா இருக்குது. லேண்ட் அக்விசிஷன், அப்புறம் லேண்ட் டைட்டிலிங், அந்த எல்லாத்தையும் தொடர்புபடுத்தி இந்த லா எப்படி இருந்ததுன்றது இதுவரைக்கும் நாங்க பார்க்காத ஒரு பார்வை. பியூட்டிஃபுல் தோழர். எனக்கு அதுல எந்த விதமான இது இல்ல. நிறைய மைண்ட் ரொம்ப இதாயிருக்கு. அப்புறம் ரீட்டைலிங் ஃபுட்டு, அப்புறம் அந்த எல்லாம் ரொம்ப ஒரு அழகா ரொம்ப லிங்க் பண்ணி இந்த லா எப்படி ஸ்டெப் பை ஸ்டெப்பா வந்திருக்கு, இதோட தொடர்ச்சி எப்படி இன்னைக்கு ஃபைனலா எல்லாருமே நம்ம இந்த லா பத்தி தான் பேசிட்டு இருக்கிறோம். இந்த லாவை எப்படி இம்ப்ளிமெண்ட் பண்ணா இன்னைக்கு எந்த கவர்மெண்ட் இருந்தாலும் இந்த இம்ப்ளிமெண்ட் பண்ணுன்றது ஒரு பியூட்டிஃபுல்லான ஒரு இது. ரொம்ப நல்லா இருக்கு தோழர். எனக்கு ஒரே ஒரு கொஸ்டின், இந்த லேண்ட் டைட்டிலிங் சொன்னீங்க தானே தோழர், அது வந்து இப்ப இந்துத்துவனுடைய அஜெண்டா வந்து காஷ்மீர்ல அந்த 356 எடுக்கணும், அங்க வந்து வீடு வாங்கணும் எல்லான்றதும். பட் இந்த லேண்ட் டைட்டிலிங் கிட்டத்தட்ட அந்த அந்த இடத்துல லேண்ட் ஆக்குபை பண்றதுக்கும் ஒரு ஒத்து போகுது தானே தோழர். இதுவும் எப்படி தோழர், இது ரெண்டும் நம்ம எப்படி பாக்குறது? இந்த ஆக்ட்ல இருந்து அப்படி மாத்திக்கிறாங்களா, இல்ல இவங்க பவருக்கு வந்தோடனே இவங்க அஜெண்டா இருந்ததை அதுக்கு சாதகமா பயன்படுத்திக்கிறாங்களான்றத மட்டும் எனக்கு சொன்னீங்கன்னா போதும். தேங்க்ஸ் தோழர். Thank you.
Okay. All right. The first part, the first thing was, that he appreciated the talk, and I won't go into a more detailed conversation, but it's a translation of that. But his essential question is on land titling and land acquisition, which has happened. And his question was, how do we understand Kashmir, where land titling had thoroughly happened, and then now the government has removed 370 and occupied Kashmir and tried to introduce land land acquisition in that way. I think, and this is my whole thing about the interesting thing about Kashmir, that it is the only state where land reforms had been thoroughly implemented. And now, by removing these constitutional status of Kashmir, in a way, the central government has got complete authority over all the land in Kashmir. So it now has the power to make laws for Kashmir on whatever basis. Because the farmers have land titles in Kashmir, already clear titles, whether that is going to lead to more acquisitions because all they need to do is to pay a pittance as a compensation and the state's obligation is done, or whether the farmers will go into contract farming for, I don't know, saffron farmers or apple farmers or whatever it is. We don't know yet, because the occupation of Kashmir changes the land question. Definitely from the Indian government side, it is land grab in a large scale. It's a huge land grab there. Whereas in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and all that also, it was land grab, but they had to, de facto do away with the constitutional protections of Adivasis, Schedule 5 protections, as we call them, etc. So Kashmir is an open question. We don't know where that will go and how. If these farmers' agitations continue, then it will definitely be strengthened, all the other movements in India, democratic movements in India, including Kashmir. I don't know, Velu, if that answers your question. Enappa பதில் சரியா இருந்ததா வேலு?
நான் என்ன நினைச்சேன்னா, அந்த அந்த அவங்களுடைய இந்துத்துவ அஜெண்டா ஒண்ணு இருந்தது இல்லைங்களா, அந்த அவங்க வந்து காஷ்மீர்ல வந்து 356 எடுப்பன்றதுக்கும் இதே நேரத்துல இந்த இன்டர்நேஷனல் லாஸ் வந்து இம்ப்ளிமெண்ட் பண்றது ஸ்டெப் பை ஸ்டெப்பா வந்து நீங்க சொன்னீங்கல்ல, ஒரு வேர்ல்டு ட்ரீட் இன்டர்நேஷனல் ட்ரீட்டில வந்து கையெழுத்து போட்டாச்சுன்னா இங்க வந்து இது மாதிரி எமர்ஜென்சி லா பார்லிமெண்ட் கிட்ட அப்ரூவ் வாங்க தேவை அவசியம் இல்லைன்றதுக்கும், இப்ப இது சேம் டைம்ல இந்த ஆக்ட் 356 இவங்க சேம் டைம்ல இன்ட்ரோடியூஸ் பண்றதுக்கும் கூட ஒரு இன்டர்நேஷனல் அஜெண்டா இருக்குமோ அப்படின்ற மாதிரியான ஒரு திங்கிங் ஒன்னு தோணுது நமக்கு.
அது சொல்ல முடியாதுப்பா. What he is saying is there an international dimension to the occupation of Kashmir, and might there be an international hand in the removal of the special status? That is his question. I think that is a question that is different. I think there is, but that's a different question from the agricultural question. Because that question has to do with the increasing proximity and defense alliances with the United States in particular, intelligence sharing, defense, purchasing, allowing more Lockheed Martin to come to India to, produce arms. So, and that larger agenda is a geopolitical agenda, not an agricultural one, strictly speaking, on the encirclement of China. But that's a So Velu, if you're asking, is there an international connection there? I see imperialism everywhere. And that is my problem. So I think there is. And one can have an analysis like we did today on the various defense procurement, nuclear and treaties, naval treaties, all those things that has been going on since 1995. Indian Ocean treaties, that's a security, that's a geopolitical issue. I don't think it has directly, there is no direct in the international hand, except that nobody is speaking about Kashmir. Nobody's speaking, everybody's quiet. It's very happy, otherwise they would be jumping up and down, human rights violation, this happened. We are always very quick to jump on human rights violation when it suits our own national interests, aren't we?
Okay, now it is almost going to be 8:30. Generally, we wind up at 8:30. So we can have 2 more questions. I think Surinder will go, then Lake. Okay. Or Lake wants to go first?
Jim wants to go as well.
Who?
Thank you very much for that very insightful talk. What I wanted to ask you, you began by saying you hoped that these sort of chats would lead somewhere. But in relation to that, I wanted to ask, do you think that the farmers' movement, the Indian farmers' movement, should now be making connections with other people in other countries and drawing those international connections, asking those big questions about why states are being forced to do such things?
It's an interesting question, and it's not for me to say what the farmers' agitations should or should not do sitting here in London, but I can just make a couple of observations on that. And one is that regardless of what the farmers' agitations do, we still have an obligation as diaspora, as people who believe in certain, core principles, values, whatever it is you want to call that. We still have an obligation to speak out on these things and to do something together, to be heard, because otherwise nobody's going to hear us. The other thing is, as far as international movements of farmers against WTO, that has been there even before WTO was formed. So in India, for example, in Karnataka, the farmers' associations have always been part of Via Campesina, which is the main, network of farmers' movements, for example. India is not as aligned to it, except Karnataka, and to some extent maybe Andhra, but Karnataka is the only main member, if you like, of this international alliance. But otherwise, it has been limited. I do feel this is my personal thing, that the farmers' movement should pay more attention to these international aspects. However, it is what they do in India that is going to be the main force of this. I mean, all the other things is just support work. The main, forces is theirs and there. And so I would say, whether they do it or not, let us try and do it. Because it's not a, somebody's personal or thing. It's our country, and and it's our world, if you like. So we just have to do what we think is possible to do.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not. It's a bit roundabout, but it's not. But really, what can we do except saying, what can we do here to draw attention to these questions?
Paul and Lake, and I think Paul. Yeah, you have to unmute.
Thomas, I think Jim wanted to say something as well.
Oh, James.
I'm happy for James to go first.
Yeah, James.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to. I'm quite concerned about how the class relationships in agrarian society in India relate to the farmers' movement and to the overall structure of the legislation and international control that you've been dealing with. As far as I'm aware, the agricultural society in India is still highly differentiated, and there are still very many villages where they're controlled by landlords or rich peasants, and large numbers of the peasants have very little land or are landless. That because land reform has effectively done nothing to change that. And in those circumstances, where these changes are being brought in, and the possibility of contract farming and making links between agriculturalists and big business and so on are concerned, it seems to me quite possible that the rich farmers and landlords who dominate in those areas are going to be quite happy with getting, and initially anyway, with getting involved with these kind of reforms, and that they are not going to necessarily support the larger farmers movement, and they're not going, the poorer peasants, landless and so on, have got no real basis to unite with them anyway.
James, there are two things. I'd be very cautious about making generalizations about class differentiation in India. As I say to, people, it's useful as a construct to see India as 29 countries, because each state has a different kind of differentiation, a different land history, different, etc., etc. So in some parts, there is extreme feudalism of the old type. In other places, Maharashtra, we were just talking about cooperative farming, and so on and so forth. The difference, I think, this time, as opposed to, let's say, the Green Revolution, where clearly there were some rich farmers who thought they would benefit from it and they could, make use of it and they did benefit from it. Yeah. But now I think with the retail lobby taking the leadership, it's the retail lobby that is taking the leadership and entering into agriculture. It's not a section of the farmers who are saying, we want contract farming or we want this or that. It is the retailers who are pushing for, pre-buying produce, for introducing certain practices that we have seen in Western, corporate agribusiness practices. And it is the retail sector that is pushing it. And that is why the focus on Adani Ambani. It's not coming from the rich farmers. In case of Sharad Joshi, yes, that was an attempt by some of the rich farmers who are already in cash crops for typically, they were all cash crop, bananas, those kind of crops, cotton, who are trying to push for that kind of thing. But I do think that this time it's qualitatively different. And that is why there is, as I said, the objective conditions are pushing a cross-section of farming people to come together. And that is what we are seeing now. And that is why in Gujarat, for example, farmers wanted to come to Delhi just to express support with this. And they were all stopped from coming. Yeah. In Tamil Nadu, there is 2 campaigns are going on. One by the DMK, which is saying we should support the farmers, and the other, which is in coalition with the central government, with the BJP, on saying that, this is going to do you good, etc. Our APMCs are not like Punjab. Our APMCs are doing well, etc., etc. So I think there is a slight difference here, and one needs to, I mean, I take your point about class differentiation, but there is also something that is quite national, in that brings a cross section of classes sometimes and divides them sometimes. And this is that moment. That is why green revolution, for example, didn't take off at all. I mean, there were also at that time also people opposing, all kinds of things. This is not, but there was a euphoria. This is going to modernize Indian agriculture. That's not happening here. Nobody is talking about, the great modernizing effect of, retail sectors taking over agriculture, except of course the Modi government.
Okay, Lake, we'll have the last question. Lake.
Okay. Something we've not talked about, and that is this thing about how the current farming practices are not efficient, and if we introduce all these new laws and things like that, and contract farming and all that kind of thing, that suddenly we will, tenfold increase the output production of farming. That's something I think Radha has not actually touched upon. But my underlying question really is that, you have Ambani and Adanis promoting this new laws and this WTO agenda. The question is Ambani and Adani a nationalist, or is he actually singing dancing to the tune of some kind of a deep state? I don't know what the world corporatization, and what if what I suspect that is what is happening, is that Ambanis and Danis are not single players. They are actually a part of a club. And what is the agenda of this club? I think the days have gone by where you could actually invade countries and loot and plunder. But nowadays that there's a new form of colonialization, which you touched upon right at the beginning of your talk. There's a new world order. And how do you control the world? How do you dominate the world? You dominate the water reserves, you dominate the mineral resources, you dominate the food reserves. And this is the whole part and parcel of the project. And this is not coming through to the people in a way it ought to be. So question is Ambani and Adani a nationalist, or is he a part and parcel of a global project?
See, there would be no Adani Ambani without globalization. You see, earlier the British government produced Tatas who made money from the opium wars in China. The Sir Vittal Das Thakursi, who was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen. Yeah, they would not exist without that aspect. And I think this is important to understand, that India, okay, I don't want to go into history too much, but I think the question that you have touched on really requires, a more longer answer. And I think Thomas has already said that the time was here to wind up, but I'll just, in a nutshell, say that India was always a special category within the British Empire. The British Empire had 5 kinds of administrative structures. and one of the 5, they had colonies, protectorates, the mother country, and so on, one of which was India. India was a specific administrative category. Yeah. And India was a specific administrative category because it was the base for the empire to, get all of the other regional powers. So India was used to colonize Iraq, Southeast Asia, all those things. In the World War, it was a supply center. India has always played. When I look at that history, India still continues to play that role. And Indian elite, call them elites or upper classes or whatever, have always been part of this. Not now. Since the East India Company, they have always played that role. The Nawabs and the, sided with them. The Thakursis and the Tatas sided with them. Now the Adanis and Ambanis are doing with them. What is new in this? Because without those kind of regional powers, South Africa in Africa, India in Asia, Brazil in Latin America, the empire system works in a certain way. And they can't do without these kind of regional bases. I mean, it's a big operation.
Okay, thank you.
So that is why Adani Ambani's growth comes with globalization.
Yeah.
I'm going to.
I just want to say,
Kalpana, want to ask.
it is a very big subject. I think we need to touch upon it next time, and I think there is something bigger than the nationalism of Adani and Ambani. There's something bigger playing on. But anyway, thank you very much, and I appreciate this discussion. If Thomas wants to call it, let's call it quits.
Kalpana wanted to say something.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It would be really great for our group if we came back and developed that. It's better to have further discussion rather than try and sort of squeeze it in quick answers. Would be
it's a very big subject again, like the geopolitics and encirclement of China. That's another big subject. So and these are all quite.
But in relation to agriculture, I would say ecology and GMOs and all that would link with the agricultural business too. So
that would all be part of the infrastructure, the seed patenting, and that is how the BT cotton came, BT brinjal came to India. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you very much. We will continue our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lovely having this conversation with all of you.
Oh, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thomas.